This is going to be your best
Listen.
podcast ever.
Epicurean. But OFC and pink lemonade's pretty damn good. It'll put your boat in the marsh. Jesus did not die so you could eat yellow number 5. Excitable.
The nose starts off gentle with noticeable sense of grain that takes shape in the form of fresh baked bread.
Ma'am, you're in the wrong podcast. Educated-ish. I have used the term overproof for so long without really knowing what it
constitutes.
Because for
Is
me,
there a definition officially?
welcome to Bitches and Bourbon. Hello, Bitches and Bourbon universe. This is your host, April, and we're going to do things a little bit different today. The funny thing is I feel like I say that all the time anymore. Like things have gone so far afield of where Reba and I originally started that it's just kind of typical that when we come out here, we're like, hey, y'all, we're going to do something different. And we love that you guys hang out with us when we do that. Today is going to be a lot different in that Reba isn't even here. I know. I'm as disappointed as you are. But life does what life does. But she cannot wait to be back with us the next time. However, lucky for you, I am not alone. I know that would suck, right? How boring would that be? Instead, I have my daughter, Rue, is here with me today. Hello, honey.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
This is your first time on the show.
It is.
How do you feel about that?
Fine. I was on the TikToks before, but I've never been on this before.
Does it feel any different yet?
Yeah. I'm mostly sober right now.
Indeed. Well, let's see what we can do about that. What do you think? And before we discuss how that's going to go down today, I would like to introduce our second guest today, Dr. Jack Simmons. Would you like to introduce yourself, sir?
I think you did a great job. I'm happy to be here.
Well, tell us where you're coming from and why you're here.
I drove up from Savannah, or down from Savannah.
It is down, yeah.
It is down, yeah. And I came by invitation, primarily the invitation from your daughter.
Would you call it an invitation?
No.
Or would you call it an insistence?
A summons.
Indeed.
And I've had the pleasure of having her in my class all semester.
Nice. And that is a philosophy class out at Georgia Southern University, is that correct?
That's right.
And I have not had the pleasure of taking that class. I did take Introduction to Philosophy on the Armstrong campus, but it was with Luke Higgins.
Right.
Who I do not think is there anymore.
He's not.
Almost made me a philosophy major instead of an English major. I was super...
It actually did that to me.
It almost did. It almost did, except for the next semester. The next semester I met Jane Rago, and that was it.
Jane is great.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, once I met Jane, I was like, okay, this is where I live now. And I was like, we're friends and you love me. And she's like, hold on. And I was like, it's good. And then I became a fangirl and it was ridiculous. But anyway, that's how that journey happened. Yes. So I think that's a great intro. Like, Rue, would you like to explain why Jack was summoned?
Because I had to read this for a paper for his class.
So I'm going to go ahead and
No, I didn't have to read that. I picked that out of the list.
I'm going to slow you down and tell you this is not TV. So when you say things like this and hold up the book.
Okay. All right. So I had to read this book that he wrote. I think it was the only book on the list, like the only novel.
It was the only work of fiction.
Yes. And I was being a little biased because a few of them had your name on it, and I was looking for ones that did. And I picked that, and then you explained it to me before I read it. And it was like, yeah, it's New Orleans and booze. And I was like, my mom would love that. And the more that you were talking about it, and I was like, that's my mom. That's my mom. And then I was like, wait, why don't we just put this on the podcast? And then I was like, wait, why don't we just put you on the podcast? And then that worked, and here we are.
I am very, very glad that I got a chance to read it. I'm super glad that it was an idea. So everyone knows, the book that we're talking about is called 3 Bitters. It is by Jack Simmons. It is a work of fiction. And tell us a little bit about it. When was it published?
2017, I think.
And I'm going to go ahead and start. I'm going to go ahead and start with, I am most fascinated, if you don't mind. Oh, let me slow down for my bitches in the bourbon universe. So, Jack, why don't you first tell us about the drink you bought us today?
Yeah, so in honor of talking about a novel set in New Orleans, I brought Pimm's, which is a popular New Orleans drink, especially at at the Napoleon House in the French Quarter, they serve the Pimm's Cup, which you can drink pretty much anywhere, but it's a really nice New Orleans drink, and it's a great day drinking drink. And since we were meeting today at noon, I thought that was appropriate.
You're so smart.
And it's a good day drinking drink because it's not uniquely strong. It's not like drinking bourbon all day. You know, we won't be on our ear in an hour. And you can drink a lot of them.
I'm thinking, yes, this episode will be exponentially easier to edit because we start talking in cursive when we're doing some of the other
Sure.
drinks. It is delightful. So as the audience knows, I am not typically a cocktail girl. We are typically neat. We are typically on ice, but this is really, really good.
Yeah, so I like cocktails. I also like alcohol neat. I like beer and I like wine, aperitifs. I'm hard pressed to find an alcohol that I don't drink.
I as well. I typically veer away from the sweeter stuff. Finding a gin that I like is hard. Hendrick's is probably the only gin that I drink because I like the florally gins. I don't like the licoricey, woody gins. I don't particularly care for those. Rum typically gets to be a little sweet for me. But as far as the whiskey goes, there's few things that I won't. As a matter of fact, I think after we do this for a minute, I think I'm going to pull that Glenlivet out. I got a Glenlivet 25 over there that I bought when I got accepted into the master's program at Georgia Southern. And your characters talk about great Scotch, so I figured why not pull out
I can force myself to drink a 25-year-old Scotch.
Scotch?
Yeah.
Great.
probably force it down.
I'll be really honest there. I've got the Highland Park 18 up there as well. And a difference of 7 years, you wouldn't know it. That Highland Park 18 is probably my favorite thing on the bar. The Glenlivet's nothing to sneeze at. It's very, very good. But yeah, then I'll have to twist your arm for
my arm.
25-year-old Scotch. Because I figure Milton likes great Scotch. We'll do great Scotch. And God, I'm so fucking good at this segue stuff, even when I don't mean to do it. So 3 dashes bitters. The thing that I am most interested in from the onset is the process. Like how does that go? Like how does that go from a blank Word document or whatever it is you use to go, I got a fucking story to tell?
Yeah, that's a great question. Usually I don't have a lot of stories to tell. I don't walk around with a pile of stories that I feel like need to be on paper. I don't feel like, wow, everybody needs to hear these stories that I have. But when a story comes to me, it usually comes fairly complete. And so the writing process is pretty quick. Once I have the idea, it probably took me half a year to write this. And I was working. I had other jobs that I was fully employed at that time. The editing is longer. It always takes a long time to edit this kind of thing. Because you make an edit in one place and then it messes up everything afterwards. You have to go through and make sure you caught everything. But I had always been particularly fond of 19th century literature, the leisure class literature. A bunch of women or a bunch of men sitting around in a big house with nothing to do, except wake up in the morning and decide, what are we doing today? And it's always kind of been the goal of my life to live that life.
New Orleans is great for that, right?
Yeah, precisely. And it occurred to me one day, because I was a graduate student for a very long time. It took me 4 years to graduate from undergraduate school, but I was in graduate school for 9 years. And those are the 9 best years of my life. And the great thing about graduate school is you don't actually do anything. And that's, I think, what appealed to me about it. We would wake up every morning. My roommate and I would wake up, and about noon, and we would gather our friends together and play basketball all afternoon. And then when basketball was done, we would try to decide where we were going out to drink that night. And we did that for 9 years, I guess.
I love that.
Right? It was really
It gives
great.
me hope for grad school.
Right? It was really good. And the best thing about it, though, is my roommate, when I had arrived in graduate school in New Orleans, he had already been there for 5 years. And he was there 2 years after I left.
Holy shit.
Yeah, so, he had perfected this. And we were living on our assistantships, on our university stipends. Tuition, of course, was free. We only had to pay for our room and board and our alcohol, and that was it. And we lived frugally, which meant we drank at night and played basketball during the day, and occasionally went to a class or taught a class or whatever it was, and that was it. It was fabulous.
So I'm assuming that's where Milton comes from.
Yeah, so the character Milton is a combination of my roommate, Tom Hebel, and my uncle, Milton Jansen. And my uncle was a flamboyant New Orleans. He grew up in New Orleans. He went to college in New Orleans for a very long time to avoid a variety of... I think he stayed in college to avoid being drafted for the Korean War, and by the time he graduated, I think he was still avoiding the Vietnam War. So he was in college also a really long time, and he was just very much a kind of a man about town. He had even eventually, to avoid going to the military, to fight a war, he had joined the Coast Guard, and he was kicked out of the Coast Guard, and this was at a time when the military people will laugh when I say this, was less organized than it is now. And he was he was shifted because he had, at that point, he had a master's degree and a law degree, but he had just enlisted in the Coast Guard, again, to avoid the draft. And so they shifted him to the Army. He was sent to San Francisco by train, and he arrived at the Army base in San Francisco, and they didn't know he was coming. And he had papers moving him into the Army. But the Coast Guard doesn't really have the power to move somebody into the Army, but they did. So when he arrived in San Francisco, they gave him a barracks that was empty except for him. And they gave him a hammer and took him out to where there were a bunch of rocks, and they said, break rocks. And he did that for 2 days, and then he realized if he slept during the day, nobody noticed that he wasn't breaking rocks, and he would go out every night. And my uncle was a gay man and very much enjoyed going out in San Francisco at night. And he did that for 2 years, getting a paycheck.
I love that.
And doing nothing else. And one day someone figured it out and walked out there and said, what are you doing here? And he said, well, I'm breaking rocks for 2 years. Of course, he hadn't actually broken any rocks, but that's what he said he was doing. He had a whole barracks to himself. And so they forced him to join the Navy. They sent him back to New Orleans and made him the chauffeur for some admiral. And at this point, the story may become apocryphal.
Hello, handsome man that belongs to
You guys
me.
are good to go now? I'm going to go back to actual work.
Hey, are you going to kiss me first since you walked all the way out here? Thank you.
Love you.
I appreciate you. I love you too.
Jack, you want to kiss too, buddy?
Chauffeur.
So, yeah, he gets put in the Navy to be the chauffeur for an admiral, or this is how, let me see if I can get this thing right. This is how the story goes, at least. And my uncle drank a lot, and he got drunk and drove the admiral and the admiral's car into a canal in New Orleans. And at that point, they said, we don't think we need you anymore.
You think?
And so he got some kind of discharge. Nobody in the family really knew what that discharge was. But when he died, we got a flag from the military. This was back in the days when you automatically got a flag if you had been in the military and died. And one day, at my doorstep, a flag, because my uncle never had any children, and I am his only living relative, one of the big full funeral flags arrived, which is the flag hanging in my office.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's it. That's his flag. So I've always admired him for his kind of approach to life. And so the character, the name, and a lot of the character is based on him.
Well, I'll tell you, that was one of the things about the book that I was also kind of curious about was the time period in which it was set. Because the K car is 80s and not in its prime. Right? So we've got to be late 80s, early 90s because there's no cell phones, no pagers.
Right.
So, I mean, is that about where we're at?
So that's a great question. By the time the novel actually went to press, it was clear that the timing was a little confusing, at least to me. I had originally planned that the novel would be in between the two George Bush presidencies. So without any notion of Bill Clinton existing. But the idea that anytime... I've kind of got this theory that anytime a Bush is elected president, we go to war with Arabs and we have a recession.
Right.
And I had the misfortune of graduating from undergraduate school during the first Bush recession, and then leaving graduate school during the second Bush recession. So there was kind of that idea in mind, but I really wanted it to feel atemporal. And I didn't want to include any technology like cell phones because I wanted the reader to feel like this could be 1990, it could be 2000, it could be, right? It didn't place it very much. But of course now with the development of smartphones, if you don't have smartphones in any kind of literature, you're really setting it before 2010.
Well, and you have the answering machine, right?
Right.
So there's the answering machine, which I thought was hilarious. So I guess I should back up just a little bit because I really was just so fascinated by some of the way that the stories went that I kind of got a little too far. So Three Dashes Bitters is a story set in New Orleans. Milton, who is not my favorite character. He's my second favorite character because, interestingly enough, Roberto is my favorite character. And neither of which are the main character, who is also delightful. But his name is Tim, or Timothy. And what I found I'm still trying to get ahead of myself. So Timothy has moved to Boston from New Orleans and has come back for his sister's debutante ball, which is happening right before the Mardi Gras season, right?
Right before Christmas.
Which is so much fun because that's such an exciting time in New Orleans. Like when people who are not from New Orleans think of Mardi Gras, we think of the parade during that week. And what a lot of folks don't know is the Mardi Gras season really does start right around Christmas time.
Yeah, it's like 6 weeks long.
Right. I mean, the season goes on for a super long time. And it's really a way of life down there for folks that are involved in it. And around those things are some coming out parties, debutante balls, and those kind of things for the society families there in a place where family is still a very big deal. Even in Savannah, we see that a lot. It's an ongoing joke, even now that Savannah has become one of the more progressive southern cities, mostly I would venture to say because of our large SCAD population and the kind of influence of creative that's kind of put into Savannah. One of the first questions people will still ask you are, who are your people? Right. Like, who is your mom and them? Like, where did you go to school? Or are you BC? Are you St. Vincent's? Did you go to Country Day? Like, those things are still a pretty good piece of the fabric that is Savannah. And we see that in this, because New Orleans is not a whole lot different. My husband is actually from New Orleans. And when he moved here, he was like, it's so much like New Orleans. So I really enjoyed like the columns and the mermaid and all the different, like you were really true to like the different locales. But anyway, Timothy comes home for his sister's debutante ball. I don't want to give a whole lot of spoilers away, so I'm going to make sure that I run through it slowly. Although I don't know that this is really a book that's built for spoilers. Like it really isn't a, oh, look, gotcha kind of book, right? You do what Vonnegut says to do, right? Tell the reader, tell them early, let them know what you're going to tell them, right? And you really did that, which made the book easier to settle into because you're not trying to figure out the twist, you're trying to figure out the point. And that was very kind of cool to kind of walk through this book. But anyway, Tim comes home, sister's debutante ball, goes on a date with an old girlfriend who he finds out, he realizes he's still in love with her. She is marrying his brother, which nobody knows, but now him. So that was a lot of fun. I thought the book was, so Tim was very interesting. Rue had some pretty strong feelings about the main character.
In what way?
And that you called him a coward.
Well, yeah. I mean, except that was the right thing to do because what did you say about it?
Yeah, his name, Tim or Timothy, is supposed to reflect the idea of being timid.
Nice. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Maybe it's an age thing for me, but there's a lot of times in here, especially when you're talking about women, where I'm like, I wonder how this conversation would go if we were talking to like an 18-year-old woman, a 23-year-old woman, a 28-year-old woman, a 32-year-old woman, a 46-year-old woman, like all in the same room. How those conversations would go different when those different kinds of women talked together. Because I thought that was pretty interesting because I didn't really find Tim timid, I found him. He is kind of what happens. He is one of the options that happens when you have a strong Southern family. Like those men either become, like I thought his dad was kind of a cool guy. I noticed you didn't give the parents names. Like not all of your characters have names. Talk about that.
Yeah, so I don't want to overpopulate a novel.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want the reader to have to think about too many different people. It's not that overpopulated novels are bad. I love Tolstoy, and his novels have so many people in them with so many names, and the names change, and I appreciate that in Tolstoy. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to keep it very clean, and I wanted it to feel clean is just the best kind of word to describe it. I wanted it to feel really minimal. And so, for example, the Arizona Brothers, we never get their names.
Never.
It turns out that the Arizona Brothers are based on real characters who lived with me, who were from Arizona. And I don't know their names, and I'm not sure I ever learned their names. And they lived with me for 6 months.
If you're out there, what are your names?
Right, if you're there, right.
You know he's talking about you.
Please write in.
You know he's talking about you.
And but I didn't want to... I wanted the reader to be able to think of these people more like a feeling rather than if I give them a name, it almost separates them from you. But lots of us know these kinds of people, and so I wanted to let the reader attach themselves to a character like that they already know, like the mother and the father. The father who's kind of aloof and realizes that family life is out of his control. And so he's simply trying to live his life with as much dignity as possible. He's really based very loosely on a character who only appears in a single line, I think, of Oscar Wilde's play, The Importance of Being Earnest, when the aunt is upset that the table arrangements are going to be thrown off, right, at dinner, and so they're going to have to ask the husband to eat upstairs by himself. And that's like the only reference to the husband. But that's who this character is really based on. The guy who is going to have to,
She mentions him, like, in a few very vague ways that are not about the husband at all and are entirely about herself.
Precisely. And so that's what this Mr. Schmidt is based on, this character. And so you'd asked me earlier, about writing the novel. I'd always been drawn to this 19th century literature of people sitting around. And I realized that graduate students are the contemporary leisure class. So we don't have a leisure class the way the 19th century English had, but we have these graduate students.
So isn't that interesting, though? Because, like, just what I was talking about when we talk about the women, right? And how a bunch of different women sitting around would have a whole bunch of different ideas about how that works, right? And I just found it, and then I got distracted and lost. Oh, there it is. So towards the end, Tim is trying to figure out how to get Jane back, or at least to not be disgusted with him. And Roberto, who is really my favorite character for a whole lot of different reasons. Tim is convinced that Jane is mad because she caught him on the golf course with Holly in a completely innocent situation that did not look innocent at all. And Roberto's like, she doesn't care about that. She only cares about herself. That is not what it is. This Jane is a clever girl. I love that, right? But then when he was like, yeah, that's not it. And what Roberto said, he says, look, women are just like us. They don't have any mystical capacity to hear your heart or read your mind. They don't know what you really think. All they can do is judge your actions. What we men ask as evidence of love is that she sleep with us. Girl sleeps with you, you know she digs you. Simple enough. But women know that most men sleep with women rather indiscriminately. I should mention that this tendency has done more damage to the art of seduction than any other single factor. I loved that. I thought that was fantastic. And so I think that when you talk about the grad student, like when you talk about the women, what was the line that you mentioned about the women, about like the grad school or something? I can't remember. Anyway.
Is it the new car smell line?
Yes, maybe. Maybe. What was it?
An 18-year-old girl still has the new car smell?
Yeah, maybe that was it. And so because you hear all these stories about grad students that are just completely beside themselves. Like there's whole Facebook groups and TikTok channels and Instagram pages dedicated to the complete desolate nature of the overworked, in tears, overcaffeinated, underpaid, underslept, underrested, completely stressed out graduate student.
Yeah.
So what do you? I mean, what do you think? What do you think that's about?
It's an obscenity. It's shocking to me, and I'm perfectly aware of it. And when I was in graduate school, we used to joke that it was almost the profession of graduate students to complain about how horrible graduate school was. And my roommate and I would regularly respond by saying, "These are the gravy days. You don't understand. Your life will never be better than this. And if you're not happy now, you are never going to be happy." And I just simply dismiss that notion that being a graduate school student is difficult or uniquely challenging. I shouldn't say it. There are, of course, challenges to being a graduate student. And the primary problem with being a graduate student is that a lot of what you do is all or nothing. If you fail something, you're kicked out. I was actually kicked out of graduate school.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. And so
not permanently, presumably.
No, they let me back in. They're supposed to kick you out when you fail something. They kicked me out, but I hadn't failed anything.
Oh, why'd they kick you out?
It was I don't know.
Oh, you know.
I do know. I mean, ultimately, the real reason was the university was under this massive budget cut, and so they had to eliminate all these people. But they felt obligated when they delivered the information to us to give us a reason. And so I was kicked out for having failed my first prelim exam. And if you fail a prelim exam, you can be kicked out. And that's one of the things that causes stress in graduate school. In this particular occasion, though, I was the only one in my class who had passed the prelim, and everybody else had failed it. And so when I pointed out to the person who was kicking me out of graduate school that no, in fact, I had passed the prelim, he had to come up with a new explanation for why I was going to be kicked out, which he did. He was quick to come up with a new one.
Right.
What was the new one?
He had said that I misunderstood in a lecture I gave to a class. I had misunderstood Hegel's theory of history because I hadn't mentioned the crystallization of mind.
Okay.
I mean, he had to come up with something, so that's what he got. It wasn't very strong, but it was quick. He and I both realized that he was making it up.
Right.
And what was I going to say? You're making it up? I mean, they decided to kick me out, so I was out. But it was really just a numbers thing. Of 6 of us, they had to kick 3 of us out. So they had chosen me, and there it was. And 2 of my classmates.
I think that idea is right and fascinating because my obsession with literature is the way that one book like this is, you can look at it and you can go, this is a story, right? When I think the truth is it's an infinite amount of stories. Like every person that picks it up will find a different story in here. I can completely see how somebody could pick this book up and like me read it and go, that was kind of fun. Like I think I'd really like a drink now. That was a very interesting look into people and lives that have lived in a way which I have similarly, but not exactly, and isn't that fun. I can also see how somebody else would pick it up and go, what a patriarchal asshole, right? Like, right? Because
I did both at the same time.
Right? But for me, and I think this was probably one of the ones you were talking about, when the double date that wasn't really a double date.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a part in the book where Milton has created 2 dates with 2 women at the same time. He enlists Timothy in some help to like make this work, which involves all 4 of them in the same car, by the way, which is very interesting.
We talked about this on the plane, didn't we?
Yeah, we did. It's fascinating to me. But Milton's reasoning for it working is they are my girlfriends. That means they adore me. At least they tolerate me. The point is simple enough. Who would arrange 2 dates on the same night and then try to keep them both? The depravity of the thing is so great that it protects me from discovery. Only a confirmed cad would act in such a manner, and by definition, No woman's boyfriend counts as a confirmed cad, for if he did, then he would not be her boyfriend. Like I said, the more unscrupulous, the more likely the success.
Please tell this story.
And yes, do tell the story. But for me, the bigger story is you're not wrong. You can be as pissed off about that as you want to be. Like, as a woman, you can look at that and go, what a fucking dick. And he is. But he's not wrong. And I think when those two things live together, that's an amazingly fun place to be. When you can look at it and go, well, that pisses me off a little bit. And I would never. Well, great. That's you. And you are one of very, very few if we're all being super duper honest with ourselves. And then you did another thing, and then I'll let you ask him about the story. Because I thought this was another thing that made the story amazing. I think it would be interesting in a book club. And I'm hoping that I can, when it's my turn to pick, this will be the book that I pick, because I would like to see everybody's reaction to all the different things, because you deal with race in this book as well, in a way that is very light, without not moving into the heavy. Right? And that was actually the note that I had here, a very light touch on a pretty heavy topic, because Milton discusses race the same way he discusses the issue of the sexes, right? It's just an is thing for him. And it's not, for Milton, it's not a race issue. Race issues are contrived by the powerful elite. It's actually a class issue who has created the race issues. And Milton feels like he's been enlightened to this point where he sees it. And if he can just bring down capitalism by charging all of his great Scotch on credit cards, because that's how Milton's bringing down, right? That's how our system of power, Milton's bringing it down with charged Scotch, right?
That's exactly right.
Which is genius to me. I think I'm going to try it.
Drink capitalism to its knees.
I loved that. But it doesn't shy away from it, because he states his ideas very plainly, very clearly. He doesn't sugarcoat his thoughts about it at all. But the scene is couched in such a way where it doesn't feel like you're in the middle of this heavy, oppressive kind of this means everything conversation. And I thought that was really smart. So I am looking forward to seeing how a whole bunch of folks react to all these different pink Post-it notes that I have in here. You had a question about a story, my love.
Tell the story.
So most of the stories in the novel are very loosely based on things that really happened during those long 9 years as a graduate student. I mean, even though really we just played basketball and drank, occasionally things would happen. But there was this occasion where my very best friend in the whole world, he had a German girlfriend. She was lovely, and we were going to there was a big international student party, and we were going to attend. And of course, he was expected to bring his German girlfriend. She was part of this international group. But unbeknownst to him until that day, his old Irish girlfriend, who he had not broken up with, she just moved to Ireland, she showed up in town to surprise him. And so suddenly he has two girlfriends. I mean, he never really thought that the Irish girl was really his girlfriend once she had moved away and gone back to Ireland. But there she was. And so he says to me, what am I going to... And she knew the international students, and she'd been an international student at the university, and she expected to go to the party. And he says, what am I going to do? And I said, this is as easy as pie. He said, this is no trouble at all. Because he didn't really want to break up with his German girlfriend, since the Irish girlfriend was going to move back to Ireland soon anyway. But on the other hand, you don't want to disappoint the poor Irish girl who showed up, has flown 2,500 miles to see you, or 3,000 miles. So I said, look, we'll just go on this date, and we'll ride together, and you won't explain anything to either of them. But we'll be together, all four of us. I'll come. And each girl will naturally think that the other girl is with me. You won't have to explain anything.
Oh my God! So this was like this was your idea.
You were Tim
was.
and Milton at the same time.
It was actually 100% my idea. And I said, we're going to force the girls to sit in the back seat, and I'm going to limp and claim that I have a knee injury from the basketball game today that forces me to sit in the front seat. I said, the girls will never think twice of it. Of course, they'll slide in the back. They'll both look at the other girl and say, oh, that poor girl, she's with Jack. And they'll both pat themselves on the back for being with you, my friend. I'm not going to mention his name on the radio because I don't think his wife knows this story.
Oh, wow.
And he reluctantly agreed to go along with it, and it worked like a charm.
And I'll tell you what I loved the most about the story in the book was when it first happened. When he's first telling them their plan, I look at her and I say, "This would never work." Because, especially not with me, if it was me, because I am making friends with you. Like, this is what, we're going to have conversation. Except for then, and a chapter over, you do that. Where the girls attempt to have a conversation, and Milton bull runs all over that. And I was like, damn.
Except for that you said, like, when you were like, no, I'd be trying to have a conversation. And it was like, oh, but he talked over them so that they couldn't. And you were like, well, now I'm suspicious.
Yes. and I try to put myself in that time period, but I don't think you're that much older than I am. And I don't think that I'm that much, I would have been that much older than anybody
Sweet of you to say
in the
so,
book.
but-
No. And I'm 46. And so they like maybe 5-10 years, I would guess.
12.
Yeah, so see, I'm in. Told you. So when I'm thinking about it, I'm trying to put myself in the time period. Like, what would I have behaved like in the time period until they get to Stefan's house and the party. At some point, one of the girls is going to throw herself on top of Milton and try to make out with him, and that never happens. Like, that never happens.
What do you mean?
Well, that's the only hitch I can think of. Like, for me, especially like we're holding hands. Like, I am snuggling on you. Like, it is going to be, especially when we get to Stefan's house and there's like all of this. There's a naked man in the bedroom, for crying out loud, right? I am shocked and awed that it worked. And the more important point is, well, I don't think it would work for me.
Well, first...
And nobody wants to think that it'll work for them.
Right, of course.
The reasoning was... And that's the note that I have in there is like, this sucks because it's brilliant.
Well, it pleases me that you appreciate the eroticism of the moment. I mean, they're in New Orleans. They're in the French Quarter. They're liquored up. They're going to this party that's packed full of Germans. And they're bringing the music, we discover. They're bringing the fun to the party, and the party is dead until they arrive. But it was very important on the actual occasion of this double date that my friend and I, we knew as soon as we get out of the party, we have to throw ourselves into the thick of the mix and avoid the girls at all cost.
Okay, great. That makes sense. So who threw themselves out the window?
Yeah, so that's completely made up.
Also, that was a different party, wasn't it?
No, that was
it's the
Stefan's.
same.
No,
it's
he
the
saw
same party.
Holly. He saw Holly dancing down below, and he threw himself. He
Oh
threw
my
himself
God.
out.
Yeah, I got mixed up. Yep. You're
Yep,
right.
threw himself out.
Yep. I was
Yeah.
thinking about the first place with him and Jane.
Oh yeah.
I was thinking about that.
No.
I was wrong. Go on.
No, it was it's of course him throwing himself out the window that ends up attaching him to Holly.
Right.
Right, in this special way. The real live event is much less interesting. My buddy suddenly felt this pang of guilt because it was working too well. And
Well, good for him.
yeah, and so he took the German girl into the kitchen at this massive party and explained to her the truth of the situation, which blew up the entire party and was a complete disaster. But in my fantasy world, that never happened. He stuck with the plan in my fantasy.
Didn't you say that you basically said what Milton said and then he felt bad?
I did. I did.
Well, look.
You were like, this is why it's smart. And it was like, oh. And then it was, that sucks. This is too brilliant, you know?
That's what I wrote.
I can't do it.
That's what I said.
He felt too much guilt for what was happening, and because it was working so brilliantly.
I'm going to ask you a completely unfair question. Do you have a favorite character?
Yeah, I mean, I like Milton.
Yeah. He's my second.
Yeah,
He's
I
my
like
second.
Milton. Now, I will say about Roberto, since you mentioned him. Roberto is based on an actual human being named Roberto,
Nice.
who lives in Milan, who is in Milan right at this moment. Well, I mean, unless he's traveling. But he is a very dear friend of mine. He's Italian, and I wrote him into this novel because when I was 19 years old, I think, I was traveling in Italy by myself, and I met Roberto on a train, and we talked, and he gave me his telephone number, and he said, we weren't in Milan, we were somewhere south of Rome, and he said, if you're ever in Milan, call me. He didn't really speak very good English, and I didn't speak particularly good Italian at that time. And so I found myself in Milan a few weeks later, and I called him. And he said, where are you? I said, I'm at the train station. He said, I'll come find you. And the train station in Milan, if you've ever been, is massive. And sure enough, I'm just standing there, and he just walks right in. He says, come on. And so he starts showing me around Milan, and he asked what I was doing that night. And I said, well, I'm not really doing anything. I don't have any plans. And he was a fairly famous DJ because he has an amazing voice. And he had been invited to this pop party that was being thrown by Armani. And so he said, well, I'm going to this party that will be full of supermodels. Do you want to come? Well,
No.
right. You're a 19-year-old boy
Nope.
in Italy, and this guy says, do you want to come to a party full of supermodels?
I
Yeah.
think Friends is on.
Yeah,
Like, how
exactly.
dare you ask?
Right. So I said, no, I think I'm okay. I think I'm free tonight.
It's like Caden at the bar.
I would go.
right, exactly. Who wouldn't go? So we went, and at some point at the party, I took him aside, and of course, I didn't speak very good Italian, and I said to him, look, I'm a little intimidated by these women. And he says to me, and that's where the line actually from the novel comes, he really said this. He says, Jack, women are so easy. He says, you just take them by the hand, and you stroke their arm, and you tell them you have beautiful skin. And I remember saying, that's going to work so much better for you than it's going to work for me.
Did you try it?
I did not.
Well, see, then how would you ever know?
I will never know.
I will tell you this: the only person that never got a thing wrong in this book was Roberto.
Yeah, he's a genius.
Like he was the only one. And then when you were talking about earlier before we started to record, we talked about how you attempted to. I don't think either of us would use the word timeless for the story, but what we would say is that you didn't want to like with the names, trying to keep it clean. It seems like you were also trying to do that with the time period.
That's right.
Right, and there were things in here. Jane's Alfa Romeo. Jane slid back inside in a single fluid motion, popped the clutch, and after a jerky grind of transmission, the Alfa choked, belched, started, and off they both went. It occurred to me when I read that how many people wouldn't understand it.
Because of the manual transmission.
And how many people have pop clutch started a vehicle. But how fun is that? I'm always looking for reasons why literature is not important but imperative. Why literature is absolutely imperative. Because even somebody who is attempting to make a story that was devoid of time restrictions to where there wasn't this baggage there, there's still a moment like this where somebody like me would go, huh. And that made me smile because I've started a car like that before, or a truck anyway. Like that's a lost art. I would be scared to guess how many people know how to do that anymore. So talk about those things, like those, because you have a couple of, like, the VCR in the K car. When Rue's baby sister, she's 15 now, when she's in kindergarten, she says, I need help with this. And I'm like, you never need help with anything. And she goes, look. And it's this thing where she's supposed to explain how a fish can or cannot do things. And one is like breathe underwater, one is like swim through a hoop, and one is like turn on a VCR. And I'm like, well, how hard is this? She goes, what's a VCR? And you realize just how obsolete, like, the kids don't understand anything about pagers or rotary phones or even call waiting or busy signals, right? And so when those kind of things go into a story, do you know they're going in, or does it just feel good when you do it?
It's a little bit of both. one of the things, again, I love about this 19th century literature when it's done well, and most of what has come to us by now, is done well. I mean, most of what is lasted is done well. Is even though it's about a bunch of people doing nothing generally, it has a real physicality about it. And I wanted to capture that physicality. I wanted the audience to be able to kind of almost feel like they could touch this place of New Orleans a little bit. And so things like the manual transmission or the VCR and the frustration, of course, which reminds all of us the frustration of trying to program your VCR to record a show when you're not present. And the universal joke that nobody knew how to do it, that all the VCRs were set up so that you could record them when you weren't there and they would record a show, and nobody ever figured out how to do it. You might have had that one friend who knew somebody who could do it. But that actual machine that's referenced in the book was based on a real live event. It was a colleague of mine. I take that back. It wasn't a colleague because we weren't Georgia Southern then. When I was at Savannah State, a friend of mine, she was a philosophy professor at Georgia Southern in Statesboro, and her boyfriend had built this car. It wasn't a K car, but had built this car with the VCR in it that would project a picture on the window.
Talk about that for a second. Because every time we go to a point, it doesn't matter what point in the book we go to, like there's something very personal for you. How vulnerable is that as an author? And once you decide, hey, I've written this thing, you even mentioned it earlier, like you have this guy out there that did this thing with this double date, and we're not really sure if his wife knows or not. What we definitively know is you were in on it. And if you weren't in on it, your brain at least works a kind of way that can come up with it. Like when you put those things on paper, what is that vulnerability like to go, okay, I'm going to put this out in the world?
It's so much vulnerability that people have suggested to me, there are other instances in my life that were actually more dramatic than much of what you read in this book. And people have recommended to me that perhaps I should write about those things. And I can't because it's so difficult to put that down. And so, one of the things about this novel that you might notice, the motif I have about most of what I write is that the greatest danger in any of my novels is that maybe the cocktails will be served late. I can't handle very much tension in my novels because it is so personal that if I lean into something that is really tense, then that's from me, and I can't put that on paper for the world to read. I'm not even sure I can put it on paper for me to read. So you're right; it is very personal, and as a result, I tend towards that which is lighter. You mentioned race. Mm-hmm.
But it's not soft.
I don't think so.
No, it's definitively not soft. And it's interesting that you say that because even on page 7, when Jane and Timothy meet for their first drink, like they didn't even get very far in the small talk. It's right after. So he loses his luggage. He's got this weird ass tie that his mom bought him for Christmas. And she mentions that the tie, in a very sweet Southern bless your heart kind of way, that the tie is kind of fucked up. So she's like, for Mom? And then the very next thing she says to him, so why did you call me? And it seems to me that why did you call me was like the overarching question, the overarching theme of the book. Why do you do what you do? Why do we do what we do? Yeah. Like what kind of manner of events go into making the decisions that we make? And then he goes into this thing about inventing history. It wasn't that I was lying. It was simply that I did not remember what I had thought about Jane at the time. And I thought that was... Pat Conroy has a beautiful quote about memories and lies and owning the truth, even inside of the lies of what creates this multifaceted light that is the memory. And so I thought, why did you call me? It is such a simple, not heavy, not deeply introspective, 4-page long, multi-paragraph thought about the deep, dark longings of the people and why we decide, which is why did you decide to call me? And you feel that throughout the whole book. It's like it's there, but we trust the process enough to just kind of keep moving with life and watch what life does, and life will show us why we do the things we do.
Well, I don't know. I thought, although, like, why did you do this? And then that question of, like, where he was inventing history and he was like, I don't remember why I did that. I don't know. I'm sure I had a reason. I don't know that it was a very good one. I don't know if it was memorable enough for me to know right now to recall on command. Alarmed me immediately that, like, he doesn't really seem to have a lot of good reasons for the things he does. Like, he's kind of just doing things because here's the thing that I should probably do now. I don't know. This seems like it's like, I don't know, that's the thing to do, I guess.
Yeah, I think except for, and this is kind of what we were talking about earlier, like when you're talking about generational differences, those things are real. So you grew up in a time and in a place where think all the things, wonder all the things. You're not beholden to a social structure that's this big. Maybe you're beholden to a social structure that's this big, but it's not necessarily this big. Like, you don't have to concern yourself with family names and propriety on a scale that necessarily Tim was, in such a way where some things aren't even an option to him, so he doesn't even consider them.
Well, not an option is probably not accurate. Like, not a likely, like, not like the most proper thing to do. Like, that's accurate.
Yes, but for a person like Tim, there's a huge difference between those things. Like, for people like us, that we see that, right? We're like you say there's no choice, but there's a definitive choice. And then somebody like Tim would be like, no, there really isn't.
Except for that there is. And we proved that at the end, right?
I agree, but he had to get there. Like,
right.
He didn't start there. That's his character arc. When she says, why did I do this? He had no idea why he did that.
Yeah, but where he started is important.
That's what I'm saying.
For him to get to the end of the character arc, where he started is important.
That's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying when he said he couldn't remember why, because he didn't have any frame of reference for how to even process those thoughts. Because what we find as options, he absolutely positively
that's what I was saying.
Yeah, okay,
right.
Yeah.
So it's just
he didn't
have like a memorable reason to do those things.
Right.
Because he was just doing.
Yes.
He wasn't really thinking.
Yes.
Or like making actual choices. Like, it was like it's we're just doing. I mean, I don't know. Is that off base?
No, I think you guys got it. I think. And I think April really understands a tension that I am much better about this now than I was. And you mentioned the kind of that fear of stating truths about yourself that can be difficult. And a lot of this novel was acknowledging my behavior in the past and failures that I had made. And one of them was that it wasn't that uncommon for women to directly ask me questions. And those questions would more or less, they would amount to, what is going on in our relationship? Like, where are things? And my answers, although my answers, of course, were all over the place, the honest answer would be, which I never gave, by the way, the honest answer would be, you are asking me to know a lot about my own emotional disposition, and I don't know that. You're asking me to know something about myself that I simply don't know. But I can act. You know, I can make love to you, or I can not make love to you,
and be sincere or not be sincere. What does Milton say? Like whether or not you're sincere is not the point. You need to appear sincere.
Act sincere. That's exactly right. And this is why I could never tell the truth, right? Because if I am sincere, they're just going to be angry because I say I don't know what's going on inside of me, and that's not the answer they want to hear.
Right.
So somehow you have to appear to be sincere, which I was never particularly good at. I was good enough not to be killed. You know, I was never strangled in the night,
as evidenced by your appearance here today. Here.
But it was and it was difficult thinking back on this and thinking how I may have behaved better than I did in my youth, and I wasn't a particularly horrible human. But I feel that I was never very honest about my emotions in the past. And some of that was because I didn't know my emotions myself. I wasn't sure how I felt.
I think that's why people typically lie about things like that, is because they're just not real sure. Or they're afraid of them, or they're afraid of them in some way.
And every time I ventured into the truth, it failed horribly. And I was, humiliated myself and the poor woman opposite of me.
Well, and I am not going to get off on this tangent, but because you said it, I am going to go ahead. And then I have one last thing, so I'm not taking up your entire day. Brene Brown discusses that with, I don't know if you're familiar, but she does this power of vulnerability and the importance of vulnerability and these kind of things. And she met a man at one of her talks one time, and she's like, oh my God, it's so good, see because she's got a primarily female-based demographic. And he's like, whatever. He says the last thing you all want is a vulnerable man.
Absolutely.
Like that's
absolutely.
Like if I have to climb down off my horse and you for 2 seconds think that I can't fix it, I can't save it, I can't protect it, like you don't know what to do with that.
No.
And she did. She had to go back and like revisit some of her work and talk about the way where the ability for a female to be honest and this idea of toxic masculinity, which I'm really not going to get into because that'll go super far off into the ditch, but how that's translated into a whole group of men who they're not vulnerable because they don't want to be. They aren't vulnerable because they don't feel they're allowed to be. And the women in their lives have kind of facilitated that, which I think was completely fascinating, which is the kind of thing that I loved about Jane. You didn't make her overly sexual, although she was obviously desirable. You did not make her overly aggressive, although she was completely capable. You didn't make her overly intimidating, although she could completely take care of herself. Like Jane was just a very nice, balanced, interesting character. And I don't know how much of this stuff was intended, and I guess it matters not how much of it was intended. But in the very beginning, when she's very particular about her Sazerac order, like that, for me, I think that kind of set the tone for who Jane is as a person. Like, I'm not a bitch. Like, I'm not going to tell you, I'm not sending this drink back and telling you it sucks, right? But when you come and I go to reorder, I'm going to tell you it was too sweet. Like, it was too much, like, and she knew what she wanted. And he's like, who orders drinks like that? She's like, I do. I'm paying for, like, she doesn't say all those things. But, I mean, the general feel is me. Like, this is what I'm doing with my life. I came to a place, I know how the bars around New Orleans make their drinks. I didn't go there. I came here. Make my drink the way I'd like to drink it, please and thank you. So I really did like that about her. And speaking of New Orleans, I thought it was very interesting that when Tim moves, Tim goes all the way to Boston, and Tim spends a good part of the first part of the novel discussing the differences between Boston and New Orleans and what those unique differences are, which I'll be really honest, I didn't particularly notice until Tim is telling Jane about how he's supposed to meet his brother William at Starbucks. And he says, it's the Walmart of coffee shops. It's very Seattle. Jane laughed. Tim says it's stupid. I had to wait in line for 30 minutes to buy a cup of coffee that cost $3. I could go to a restaurant, sit down, and be served a better cup of coffee for half the price in a tenth of the time. And it was that where I noticed all of your contrast of places. Like, all of your places had a distinct contrast to them that said something about the story, right? Like, we had Boston and New Orleans. We had the mermaid and the columns. We had Stefan's apartment and Holly's house. Like, we had all of these Starbucks and where Tim could have gotten a coffee. How important was it to you to write about a place that you knew about?
Oh, it's everything. I mean, in many ways, the novel is kind of an anthem to New Orleans. And I have a deep affection for New Orleans. I am completely aware of all of New Orleans, all the flaws that New Orleans has maintained, and really they've maintained those flaws because there have been plenty of opportunities for them to clean some of their problems up, and they can't seem to do it. But I have a real affection for it. And I wanted the reader to feel that, both feel my affection for it, but also feel what makes New Orleans, that it's not a clean place, that it's full of, and I use the word diversity, not in the contemporary term, but it's full of diversity. There is beauty, and there's the ugly, and there is clean, and there's dirty, and it's all right next to each other. And our character is going to wade through all of it. His best friend Milton is essentially swindling the upper class, and yet he wants to be part of that upper class, right? And he mentions that he's invited to all the debutante parties. He's considered like the most eligible bachelor in New Orleans, and all these upper class people want Milton at his parties to meet their debutante daughters. And if they knew who he really was, they'd be the last thing they would want. So I wanted the reader to feel that, to be able to kind of to sense that tension. And And that's really, I mean, if there's a tension in the novel, and like I said, I don't want the novel to be tense. I want the greatest concern of our characters is that maybe drinks won't be served on time, right? I don't
Or
want...
too sweet.
Yeah, they'll be too sweet, right? Something's going to go wrong here. It's going to be...
Or there's no glasses.
Yeah, I mean...
Oh, no.
Oh my God, we're gonna have to drink out of the bottle? Like, no, I went.
Damn.
I went into the drugstore and bought us wine glasses so we could drink while we're driving, right? out of
Well,
glass.
yeah, because that's what a lot of people don't realize is like Louisiana is one of the last bastions of the drive-through
Of
liquor
course.
store, right? Where you get two straws, one that keeps the paper on the top and one that doesn't. Because as long as there's a paper on top of the straw,
It's fine.
it's not an open container.
Yeah. I remember even as an undergraduate student when I was a student at LSU, with one of my professors, we had season tickets to the Saints games together, and we would drive to New Orleans to watch the games, and before we would leave, he would make us a batch of cocktails to drink on the way to New Orleans in the car. you know.
Yes.
But he didn't think of this as drinking and driving,
No.
because they're just cocktails.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
all right. And he was my professor. So the times were a little bit different, right? Nowadays, you'd be fired instantly for being in the car with the professor, but we were drinking together in the car going to the games. But I wanted the reader to be able to feel this, and I did want it to be sort of visceral, like that sense of I can taste this.
Mm-hmm.
So when Tim, for example, describes why it's so important to drink wine, even though it's crappy wine. But to drink it, he says, I'll drink this crappy wine, but I'm not drinking it out of the bottle. I'm not drinking it out of a plastic cup. I need the feel of a glass cup on my lips. Like, that's important. And I wanted the reader to be able to sense that. Like, there are still dignities to be had, no matter how undignified our lives become. And that's really kind of the struggle of my whole life.
He called him a romantic there, didn't he? After that?
Probably.
Yeah, you're the last of the romantics.
Yeah.
That's for drinking out of a glass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I enjoyed it very much, and I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you coming out and talking about it with us today. Is there another one coming? Like plans, ideas, thoughts?
Have you read
Put
Thin
you on the
Tweed
spot?
Line?
Huh?
Have you read Thin Tweed Line?
I have not read Thin Tweed Line. I
Do
didn't
it.
know there was another one.
Well, so
That's a play.
yeah, technically this novel is the third novel in a trilogy, but it's a special kind of trilogy. The first novel was written by the great Southern writer Walker Percy, who wrote The Moviegoer in 1960. I hope I got that right. And then John Kennedy Toole wrote a reply to his novel, and called Confederacy of Dunces, and could not. And The Moviegoer is set in New Orleans, and the main character is Binks Bowling, and the main character is very much like Timothy. John Kennedy Toole writes a response novel that he cannot get published, and is so distraught by not getting it published that he kills himself.
Oh, God.
Jesus.
And his mother takes the manuscript, the typed manuscript, to Walker Percy's office. He was a professor at Loyola at the time. Doesn't know that this is a response to Walker Percy's novel. Doesn't know anything about the novel other than that she loves her son who's committed suicide, and hands it to Walker Percy and says, my son committed suicide. He's written this brilliant novel. Please read it. And Percy starts reading it, and immediately realizes it's brilliant, and then realizes it's a critique of his novel, which won the National Book Award. But he goes ahead and gets it published, and it won a Pulitzer Prize, and it's brilliant. The main character is Ignatius Riley, and my character Milton is really, in many ways, based on Ignatius Riley. So this ends up being, I like to fancy myself, the third of these three, but I've brought Binks Bowling in the form of Timothy and Ignatius Riley in the form of Milton together. Now they meet each other, and they travel through New Orleans. The other two novels are set in New Orleans. And Ignatius Riley was a graduate student at Tulane in the novel, The Confederacy of Dunces. And so here we have these characters come together. So I like to think of it as the third in a trilogy, even though I didn't write the first two. After writing it, I wrote a play that I really we produced it at Armstrong, and I really enjoyed producing it. It was called A Tropical Affair, and it's set in South America in the jungle. And the two main characters are really the same as Milton and Tim, but it's about 10 years earlier. And I really enjoyed it. So then I subsequently wrote another play called The Thin Tweed Line, which Rue has read.
I have.
And we produced it at Armstrong last spring. And it's really, again, the characters of Timothy and Milton, but now 20 years later from this novel. And this novel was originally going to be a play, and at some point I shifted it to a novel. But yeah, so I think I've kind of taken to writing plays for a while.
Mm-hmm. It's very Oscar Wilde of you.
Yeah, but by all means, like,
Well, no,
read the play. Please read line.
So, yeah, it was great, as we typically do when we do books with Bitches and Bourbon. Had Jack not bought the Pimms, that was absolutely delightful. I was actually going to pull out my Johnny Walker Blue in honor of Milton's love of great Scotch, because when I thought about it, I figured that Scotch would probably be more likely what they were drinking. They never named their great Scotch, just that it was great Scotch. I figured New Orleans brothers of debutantes were probably drinking Johnny Walker Blue before they were drinking Highland Park or Glenlivet. So that was actually the bottle that I was going to pull out. So that would pair nicely with this one. Evidently, a great Chianti would do well with this book as well. We never talk about whiskey in general. However, there is an affinity for bourbon, and there is one mention of a Canadian whiskey, Seagram's 7. So they never really say whiskey. It's always bourbon or 7. And so now we've got a
Is it 7 and 7? Is
7 and 7, yeah.
That's
That's Seagram's 7. That's a Canadian whiskey, which is super fun.
And milk punch, which we made.
Yeah, there's a bunch of recipes in here
which was brandy, I think, but we used bourbon.
We used whiskey. We used a pretty stout.
Oh, that was probably
we used a pretty stout whiskey.
Did we?
For
I didn't
that
even
one.
check.
Yeah, we used the Stag Junior. Yeah, we used the Stag Junior for that one. I think that one comes in at about 126.
That's pretty strong.
Yeah. Well, we were told when we asked the people that are supposed to know about these kind of things, they were like, the higher the proof, the better it'll run.
Mine was objectively better because it was oat milk, so it didn't curdle.
Yeah, but you can strain them, which is what you're supposed to do. So we're going to go back and we're going to try those things. So I got mine on Amazon. I'm sure you can get it in a whole host of different places. Jack, do you have a preferred place where people go to check
Amazon
you out?
is the place. Yeah.
All right, perfect. Great for book clubs. If you're planning to do it for your book club, let me know, because I am too. So a list of questions that we can work out together. Ruth, thank you for being here with me today. It was a treat.
Thank you.
Jack, thanks so much for coming out.
Thank you so much for having me.
Anytime.
It's been a delight.
Open invite. All right. Until next time, y'all. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for hanging out with Ape and Reba on this episode of Bitches and Bourbon.
Make sure to check out the links in the show notes, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Until next time, here's to bad bitches and good bourbon.
I mean, you have to like spicy pickle.